The summer heat of 2004 in Arlington, Texas, could not mask the chilling scene that unfolded inside an apartment on the 26th of July. The door swung open to reveal a tragedy that would forever haunt the community. A 9-year-old boy starved to death by the very people who should have protected him. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, arriving at the apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood where Davontae Williams had been living with his mother, Marcella Williams, and her girlfriend, Lisa Ann Coleman. What they found was nothing short of shocking. Davontae's lifeless body, emaciated and frail, weighing just 35 pounds at the time of his death. His tiny frame was reduced to a skeletal state, so undernourished that he appeared so much younger than his years. The initial reports from paramedics were horrifying. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was the result of months of deliberate starvation and cruel neglect. The young boy, who should have been thriving, playing outside with friends, was instead reduced to nothing more than a husk of his former self. The death was ruled as malnutrition, a homicide caused by prolonged and intentional starvation. But what made this case even more horrifying was that it could have been prevented. The question echoed through the halls of the emergency room in the investigation. How did this happen? Who was responsible for letting this child suffer? The apartment complex where Davontae's life came to a tragic end had once been a place where he should have felt safe, secure, in his own home. But on July 26, 2004, that security was shattered forever. This apartment was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where Davontae would have been protected and loved. Instead, it became a prison for the young boy. It was in this apartment where neighbors now recall hearing the occasional thud or muffled cries, where Davontae was starved to the brink of death. The pantry was stocked with food. The refrigerator was full. Yet Davontae received none of it. While others in the household ate, he went hungry. The apartment, located in the heart of Arlington, was typical of suburban homes, but inside it hid a nightmare that was invisible to the outside world. Lisa Ann Coleman and Marcella Williams should have been the people responsible for caring for Davontae, but instead they failed him in the most fundamental ways. Davontae Williams, born on June 13, 1995, was a boy who should have had his whole life ahead of him. Instead, he spent his final days trapped in a cycle of neglect and cruelty that would cost him his life. At just 9 years old, Davontae weighed a mere 35 pounds, less than many children at half his age. His small, fragile body was a stark contrast to the active, playful child he should have been. This wasn't just a boy who had lost weight. This was a child whose very body was shutting down from the lack of food and care. His condition was emaciated to the point where his bones were visible through his skin. The life had been drained out of him, and his body betrayed months of cruelty and suffering. The signs of malnutrition were obvious. His skin was loose, sagging from the lack of nourishment. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now appeared hollow and sunken. Davontae's liver was so damaged that it could no longer function properly. The toll was too great. He had been forced to endure months of hunger, bound and deprived, in a house where he should have been loved and protected. The last days of Davontae's life were harrowing, filled with intense suffering that went unnoticed by the world outside his home. Yet, to those who should have cared for him, Lisa Coleman and Marcella Williams, he was nothing more than an inconvenient presence in their lives. But the tragedy did not end with Davontae's death. It was only just beginning. Who was to blame for this heartbreaking loss? Who could be responsible for starving a 9-year-old child to death? The investigation would soon reveal a nightmarish tale of betrayal, manipulation, and neglect. But the horror didn't stop there. Marcella Williams, Davontae's mother, was the person who should have cared for him, yet she had failed in the most tragic way. She allowed her partner, Lisa Ann Coleman, to exert control over their home and their lives, enabling a cycle of abuse and starvation. But it wasn't just Marcella's failure that led to Davontae's death. It was Lisa Coleman, a woman with a criminal history and a history of poor decisions, who played a key role in Davontae's suffering. The question loomed large. How could a mother allow this to happen? How could a partner contribute to such cruelty? The investigation would uncover the disturbing answers, revealing a story of intentional neglect and deliberate cruelty that ultimately led to a child's death. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the life of Lisa Ann Coleman, a woman who became notorious for the heart-wrenching abuse and tragic death of 9-year-old Davontae Williams. We'll begin with the devastating discovery of Davontae's body, explore the shocking details of the abuse he endured, and follow the investigation that led to Lisa's conviction. Finally, we'll discuss the emotional trial and the moment justice was served. Make sure to comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you're new, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date on more true crime stories. Let's get started. In Arlington, Texas, a quiet apartment became the site of a tragedy that would devastate all who learned of it. It was in this apartment, once thought to be a home of love, where Davontae Williams would endure the neglect and abuse that ultimately cost him his life. The perpetrators of this abuse were not strangers, but those who should have protected him, Lisa Ann Coleman and his own mother, Marcella Williams. Marcella, overwhelmed and too overwhelmed, young to cope with the demands of motherhood, allowed her partner, Lisa Coleman, to take control. Though Lisa had no legal or biological ties to Davontae, she assumed the role of caregiver in a way that ultimately led to his suffering. The tension in the home, caused by the toxic dynamic between the two women, created a destructive environment for Davontae. Born in 1976, Lisa Ann Coleman's early life was marked by instability and poor choices. Growing up in an environment that lacked structure, Lisa's path was one of criminal behavior and substance abuse. Her history began with a 1993 conviction for cocaine possession with intent to deliver, leading to a 5-year prison sentence. She was convicted again in 2000 for burglary, which earned her another 2-year sentence. Despite her extensive criminal record, Lisa was granted parole and continued to live outside the system, where her actions only became more erratic. It was in this environment of poor decision-making and lack of accountability that she entered into a relationship with Marcella Williams, a woman much younger and emotionally vulnerable. As Marcella's partner, Lisa's influence in the household was undeniable. The stability Marcella lacked was replaced by Lisa's domineering presence, giving her a controlling role in all aspects of their home, including the care of Marcella's son, Davontae. Lisa's manipulative nature and history of criminality allowed her to create a toxic environment where Davontae's needs were disregarded and ignored. Marcella Williams, only 14 years old when she gave birth to Davontae, found herself ill-equipped to face the challenges of motherhood. Her youth and lack of support left her vulnerable to manipulation, especially by someone like Lisa Coleman. already facing the struggles of poverty and lack of guidance. Marcella became increasingly reliant on Lisa to manage their household, leaving Davontae in the care of someone with no maternal instincts. Marcella's emotional dependence on Lisa became a key factor in the unfolding tragedy. Unable to challenge Lisa's authority, she allowed the neglect and abuse to continue unchecked. Even when Davontae's condition worsened, Marcella's involvement was minimal at best, a consequence of her own emotional immaturity and her toxic bond with Lisa. The apartment, once a symbol of hope and security, transformed into a prison for young Davontae. While the rest of the household had access to food, Davontae was consistently denied nourishment. The pantry was stocked, yet he was left hungry, isolated, and ignored. For a child who should have been cared for, this apartment became a house of cruelty, where neglect ruled. Davontae's suffering was not the result of a single impulsive act, but rather the result of months of systematic deprivation. His physical deterioration, a body weakened from starvation, his hands and feet bound with extension cords, was a deliberate act of cruelty that went unnoticed by the outside world. His cries for help fell on deaf ears, both from his mother and from Lisa, who controlled the household with manipulation and fear. Lisa Coleman, without a biological connection to Davontae, wielded power in the home and became a primary enabler of the abuse. She controlled the daily routine, including the food, the care, and ultimately the very life of Davontae. Her dominance over Marcella meant that Davontae had no one to protect him from the escalating mistreatment. The signs of abuse were evident to anyone who cared to look. Davontae's frail condition, his emaciation, and his lack of nourishment all pointed to a clear pattern of neglect. Yet no one intervened. Neighbours, family members, and even the occasional visit from social services failed to see the depth of Davontae's suffering. As Davontae's health deteriorated, the abuse escalated, but the cycle of neglect and manipulation continued unabated. The apartment became the setting of a tragedy that should never have happened, a tragedy of unnecessary suffering that was allowed to persist. The question that haunted the case from the start was simple. How could a mother and her partner allow a child to suffer so horribly? As Davontae's health reached a critical point, the investigation began to peel back the layers of a dark reality, a reality that revealed how deeply entrenched the abuse had been. It was not a moment of rage or impulse, but a systematic cycle of cruelty that ultimately led to Davontae's tragic death. The abuse had gone unnoticed, unchallenged, until it was too late. By the time authorities intervened, Davontae's condition was beyond saving. The apartment, which should have been a safe place, had become a symbol of neglect and betrayal. The oppressive heat of a Texas summer hung heavy in the air as the days stretched into weeks in 2004. But inside the apartment, where Davontae Williams lived with his mother, Marcella Williams, and her girlfriend, Lisa Ann Coleman, there was no relief from the suffering. While the apartment had a pantry full of food and the refrigerator stocked with groceries, Davontae's plate remained perpetually empty. For months, he had been denied the very basics of survival: food, water, comfort. The stark contrast between the abundant food in the home and the starved child lying within it was not just heart-wrenching. It was a testament to the utter neglect and cruelty Davontae faced each day. His frail body, once a vessel of potential, had become a living corpse, a hollow version of the healthy, vibrant child he could have been. Davontae's skin hung loosely over his bones, his small frame reduced to a shadow of what it should have been. His eyes, once filled with wonder and curiosity, were now sunken, their bright sparkle replaced by a hollow emptiness. The energy that should have been in his playful limbs had long since been drained. His childhood had been stolen from him, his innocence replaced by hunger, pain, and isolation. Inside the apartment, Davontae's suffering went unseen by the world around him. He was a ghost in his own home, surrounded by people who were meant to protect him, but instead treated him like an inconvenience. Lisa Ann Coleman was responsible for making sure the household functioned, yet her actions were systematically cruel. She controlled everything in the house, including what Davontae ate, if he ate at all. Though the apartment's pantry was stocked with food, Davontae's meals were always withheld, making his suffering even more visible. The child who should have had the same basic access to food as everyone else in the home was deliberately starved. Day after day, his body wasting away in a house that should have been a place of safety and warmth. In addition to the starvation, Davontae was isolated, kept away from others and deprived of the love and care he so desperately needed. He was bound and confined, often kept alone in a room where the sounds of the world beyond his isolation went unheard. His humanity was stripped from him in the most brutal way, as though his very existence was not worth acknowledging. Davontae Williams was born on June 13th, 1995, a child who never had the chance to experience the joys of childhood. When Davontae's body was discovered, he weighed just 35 pounds, which was approximately the weight of a 3-year-old. He was 9 years old, but his body betrayed his age. His skin sagged over his bony frame, and his eyes were wide, vacant, showing no life behind them. The image of a child reduced to such an emaciated state is not just a tragedy, it's a horror that could have been avoided. Davontae's face, once filled with joy, now only held emptiness and pain, reflecting the cruelty that had been inflicted upon him in the most heartbreaking way. His limbs were weak, unable to move with the energy that a child of his age should have had. He was too weak to walk, too frail to lift his own head, and too powerless to ask for help. For months, Davontae's daily existence was a slow death, carried out by those who were meant to love him. He was deliberately starved, his hunger ignored by the very people who should have cared for him. It wasn't just the lack of food, it was the dehumanizing neglect that Davontae suffered. He had been restrained, often tied up with extension cords or ropes that cut into his skin. His wrists and ankles bore the marks of prolonged restraint, open sores, and raw skin from being bound for hours on end. These injuries weren't just incidental. They were part of the calculated pattern of abuse that had been going on for months, perhaps longer. As Davontae's frailty became more evident, the physical signs of malnutrition were impossible to ignore. His muscles wasted, his body unable to fight off basic infections. His immune system, compromised by months of nutritional deprivation, had become weak and unable to defend itself. Even the basic functions of his body began to shut down, but Davontae was alone, left to suffer in silence. In the days leading up to Davontae's death, his condition continued to deteriorate. His body was too weak to fight back, his immune system unable to fend off even the most minor illnesses. Pneumonia set in, a consequence of the extreme malnutrition that had weakened him beyond repair. He was left lying on the bathroom floor, an unimaginable sight of a 9-year-old boy reduced to nothing more than skin and bones. The air in the apartment was thick with neglect. No one came to his aid. No one recognized the urgency of the situation. Davontae had no voice to call out for help, and by the time someone noticed his distress, it was far too late. Paramedics arrived to find him lifeless, his small body barely recognizable, his once bright eyes now devoid of light. He had suffered alone, in a home where care and love should have been his birthright. But instead, he was betrayed by the very people who were meant to protect him. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found Davontae lifeless on the bathroom floor. The stark contrast between his condition and the vibrant child he should have been left the responders speechless. Davontae's death wasn't just a natural tragedy, it was a systematic act of cruelty. The boy who should have been laughing, playing and dreaming was instead a victim of prolonged neglect, denied the basic human need for food and care. His suffering was not the result of a single act of violence, but a deliberate campaign of starvation and isolation that was carried out day after day until it finally claimed his life. The child was gone, his short life extinguished by the very people who should have loved him. And the question remained, who allowed this to happen? On July 26, 2004, paramedics entered the apartment in Arlington, Texas, and found 9-year-old Davontae Williams dead on the bathroom floor. His body, weighing just 35 pounds, was shockingly emaciated, his skin hanging loosely over bones. He had been starved to death, and his appearance spoke volumes about the months of neglect and abuse he suffered. The apartment where Davontae had lived with his mother, Marcella Williams, and her partner, Lisa Ann Coleman, was a scene of horror. Food in the pantry, yet a child was deliberately deprived. Investigators quickly began to piece together the crime, realizing that Davontae's death was no accident, but a result of systematic mistreatment. Dr. Daniel Consolman, the medical examiner, confirmed Davontae's cause of death was severe malnutrition. His frail body was covered with over 250 marks, abrasions, bruises, and burns from abuse, including ligature marks from being bound with extension cords. The signs of restraint and physical abuse were clear. He was also left isolated and ignored. The forensic evidence was damning. Davontae had been subjected to a pattern of intentional neglect. Despite the abundance of food in the apartment, Davontae was denied access to any. The lack of food, coupled with physical abuse, led to his tragic death. The investigation hit close to home for the detectives, especially Detective Marie Carter, a mother herself. The discovery of Davontae's condition was gut-wrenching. The abuse wasn't a singular event. It was a prolonged campaign of cruelty. Each new revelation felt like a fresh blow, and the emotional toll on the team was evident. As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that both Lisa Ann Coleman and Marcella Williams were complicit in the abuse. Lisa, with her criminal history, played the central role in Davontae's suffering, controlling the household and depriving him of food. Marcella, though the biological mother, failed to protect her son, remaining emotionally dependent on Lisa and allowing the abuse to continue. The mounting evidence made it clear that this was not a case of isolated violence, but a deliberate pattern of abuse that went unchecked. The question loomed: could both women be held equally responsible? Lisa, as the primary abuser, and Marcella, for allowing it to happen, both had a hand in Davontae's death. As the investigation progressed, the realization grew that both women were accountable for Davontae's death. Lisa's criminal past and controlling nature made her the primary culprit. Yet Marcella's role as the mother, failing to intervene, became just as critical. The case was turning into a moral and legal dilemma. How could both women be held equally accountable for the death of a child? The trial of Lisa Ann Coleman begins, and the courtroom becomes the stage for a legal battle that will determine her fate. The emotional weight of the case and the overwhelming evidence of abuse lead to a tense courtroom drama. The Tarrant County Courthouse in Fort Worth, Texas, was the site of the trial that would define Lisa Ann Coleman's fate. The charges against her were grave. Capital murder for the starvation and abuse that led to the death of 9-year-old Davontae Williams. The courtroom was filled with tension as family members, investigators, and the public eagerly awaited the proceedings. Lisa Coleman, sitting at the defense table, remained stoic, her face betraying little emotion. Her defense team presented a claim of mental illness, arguing that she suffered from bipolar disorder, which may have influenced her actions. They painted a picture of a woman who was struggling with her own demons and made decisions based on mental instability. But the prosecution painted a very different picture. They described Lisa Coleman as a cold-hearted abuser who had systematically tortured Davontae. The overwhelming evidence, from the autopsy findings to the physical abuse and starvation Davontae had endured, was damning. Witnesses testified about Davontae's condition, the over 250 marks on his body, and the utter neglect he suffered. The prosecution argued that Coleman had deliberately starved Davontae, choosing to abuse him for months on end, with full knowledge of the consequences. As the trial continued, all eyes were on the jury. Would they be swayed by the defense's argument of mental illness, or would they find the evidence of intentional abuse too compelling to ignore? With the deliberation underway, the fate of Lisa Ann Coleman was in the hands of the jury, and the question of justice for Davontae remained unanswered. On September 17, 2014, the day of Lisa Coleman's execution, the stark and somber reality of the justice system took shape. She was transported to the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, one of the most notorious sites for executions in the United States. Coleman had spent the last 8 years on death row after being convicted for the capital murder of Davontae Williams. Now her fate was about to be sealed by the lethal injection. As she was led into the execution chamber, her expression remained calm, betraying little emotion as she faced the final step of the legal process. The families of both the victim and the perpetrator waited outside, knowing the long-awaited conclusion was near, but it wasn't going to bring true closure for the family of Davontae. Coleman was offered her last meal before the execution. She chose a fried pork chop, macaroni and cheese, and pineapple orange cake. Comfort food for a woman about to face the end of her life. Despite the gravity of the situation, there was a coldness to her actions. The meal was not a reflection of any remorse, but rather a final indulgence as she awaited her fate. When the moment came and the lethal injection was about to begin, Coleman's final words were brief and lacking any reflection on the life she had taken. She said simply, "I love you all." There was no mention of Davontae, No apology for the years of abuse he had suffered at her hands. No remorse for the tragic loss of a young life. Her words were devoid of the emotional weight that might have acknowledged the pain and suffering she had inflicted. As the injection was administered, Lisa Coleman became the 6th woman executed in Texas since 1976. The room went silent as the lethal dose of chemicals took effect, and within minutes, her life came to a tragic end. For many, it was a moment of justice for Davontae Williams, but for others, the finality of the execution raised the difficult question: did this truly serve justice for the boy who had suffered so much? The execution, though the law's final word, did little to heal the deep wounds left by Davontae's death. His family, especially his mother, Marcella, were left with the haunting truth that no punishment could bring Davontae back. In the end, was this truly justice for the child whose life was stolen away? Or just another tragic chapter in an even greater tragedy? In the wake of Davontae Williams' tragic death, many began to ask the same painful question: could this tragedy have been prevented? Davontae's life was marked by a series of failed opportunities, failed interventions by those meant to protect him, especially Child Protective Services, CPS. Despite multiple reports of neglect and abuse, CPS had been involved in Davontae's life on several occasions. Yet no one stepped in to prevent the escalating abuse. The systemic failures of CPS raised questions about how such a case could slip through the cracks, and how, with all the signs pointing to severe neglect, no one acted in time to save Davontae. The repeated missed opportunities to intervene and protect a vulnerable child are a haunting reminder of how easily a child's suffering can be overlooked in the system. The execution of Lisa Coleman may have closed one chapter of this painful case, but the scars of Davontae's life remain. The real question, however, is whether justice was truly served. The death penalty is meant to deliver retribution, but can it ever make up for the loss of an innocent child's life? Was Lisa's execution the final act of justice, or did it simply mark the end of a system's failure to protect a child who had been failed long before? The moral and social implications are far-reaching. Was the justice system capable of delivering real justice for Davontae, or was it merely responding to the end of a tragedy that could have been avoided? The case brings to light serious flaws in how we treat the most vulnerable members of society. Now, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the death penalty was the right form of justice for Lisa Coleman? Or was Davontae failed by the system long before her execution? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime stories that dive deep into the complex truths behind these heartbreaking cases.